Well, welcome everybody. We know that people are going to continue joining us on the call, but we'll get started. Hi, my name is Jaime Stief. I work with the Tamarack Institute. Welcome to Sustaining Social Change, Insights from Australia's Field-Building Intermediaries, a webinar with Annabelle Roxon, Tessa Boyd-Caine, and Sylvia Cheuy of the Tamarack Institute's Learning Centre. We're so pleased that you have joined us today to learn more about the unique roles of Australian field-building intermediaries, their key success factors, and how they contribute to large-scale systems-level change. So as we get started, we would like to just start with a gratitude and acknowledgement moment. I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, colonially known as Waterloo, Ontario. We encourage anybody who feels comfortable to share in the chat where they're joining us from today. And this is an important part of our steps towards reconciliation in Canada, but definitely not the last step. But it's a part of the truth and reconciliation is acknowledging the territories that you're joining from and learning more about the knowledges that shape your communities there. Next, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Sylvia. Sylvia Cheuy is the Consulting Director of Collective Impact with the Tamarack Institute's Learning Centre. She co-authored the article, How Field Catalysts Accelerate Collective Impact, with colleagues Liz Weaver and Mark Abaj, that profiles the 4 value-added as a field catalyst contributes to advancing high-impact systems-level change. And with that, I will hand the mic over to Sylvia.
Thanks so much, Jaime, and good afternoon, everybody. Thrilled to have you with us, and I want to invite you to join me in welcoming our 2 guests to today's webinar. Annabelle Roxon is the Principal Consultant for Social Ventures Australia, which is Australia's leading social purpose strategy consultancy, and she's the author of Insights on Australian Field-Building Intermediaries and Their Funding Journeys Towards Sustainable Impact, a report that documents the work of 8 Australian field-building intermediaries and also includes a real focused look at the role that funders can play in supporting this important role. And joining her is Dr. Tessa Boyd-Caine, who is the founding CEO of Health Justice Australia, a national centre of excellence for health justice partnerships. And originally a criminologist, she has worked in health, criminal justice, and human rights organizations in Australia as well as internationally. And she was previously Deputy CEO of the Australian Council of Social Service and an inaugural Fulbright Professional Scholar in Nonprofit Leadership. Ladies, welcome. Thank you so much for getting up so bright and early in the morning to join us and share your insights and wisdom. So maybe if I can, Annabelle, can we start with you maybe? The first question, and of course, Tessa, if you want to chime in and add more, you're more than welcome. But what I'm really curious about is, what is a field-building intermediary? And what did your research show about this role?
Thank you, Sylvia, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. It's actually a good morning from here in Australia. It's quite early. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you also for acknowledging country. I'd just like to mention that I'm joining from the Boonwurrung lands, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm really excited to be here today to talk a little bit about this research. And before I dive in and answer the question, or at least comment on the question about definitions, I just wanted to share a little bit about who SVA is, Social Ventures Australia, so you know who I am and where we're coming from. So SVA is a not-for-profit organisation in Australia. We work with partners to alleviate disadvantage, and our aspiration is an Australia where all people and communities thrive. We have been around for about 20 years, and the way that we drive change has looked quite different over that time period, and depending on the nature of the challenge that's facing us. So today, some of the ways that we work include consulting. That's the team that I'm from, where we help social purpose organisations, government, funders, corporates strengthen their approach to creating change. We do impact investing, where we unlock new funding sources to fund social change. We have programs where we convene cross-sector partnerships to test innovative approaches and create demonstration projects. And we do policy and advocacy, where we build relationships with government to help influence that system level change in our communities. And while we're not a case study in the research report, because we were writing the research report, that felt like it would be a bit strange to do, SBA does demonstrate many of the attributes of a field building intermediary, and we experience many of the challenges that are mentioned in the report. So throughout the discussion today, I might include some of the perspectives from SBA as well. So on to the very interesting question about definition. Thanks, Sylvia. For our research paper, we adopted Bridgespan's definition of field building intermediaries. So we talk about field builders engaging and coordinating non-profits, funders and other stakeholders to deal with critical unaddressed needs in a field, such as building partnerships or sharing best practices. We also talk about in the report, if you have a chance to read it, about 4 different types of field building intermediaries, also borrowed definitions. We talk about field catalysts, capability specialists, evidence action labs, and place-based backbones. As you probably appreciate, all of those terms, and even just the term intermediary itself, and the bounds of the definitions are not super clear. They really do mean different things to different people. And we made a decision in our research that we wouldn't try and redefine those definitions. And there's 2 key reasons for that. I guess the first is the more we talked to our intermediaries, the more it became clear that intermediaries themselves don't necessarily define themselves this way, or even call themselves intermediaries. And then secondly, those categories that I mentioned, those 4 different types, they're not mutually exclusive. It's very common for an intermediary to have attributes of many of those 4 categories. And for me, I think this really small part of the research highlights quite a foundational point, and I think we're going to talk about it more a bit later. But it's really hard to clearly articulate what a field building intermediary is and what it does. And even if you do articulate it, it's not necessarily aligned with how others would do so. And because that work is so complex and it's hard to explain, it can be hard to convey the value of a field building intermediary to others and to really explain that role in the system. And because of that, it can be hard to secure sufficient funding. So even though that really, setting the definitions was really not the kind of key purpose of the report, I think it actually surfaced a really important kind of question and challenge. I'm just going to mention 3, I guess, kind of success factors. And by success factors, I mean 3 things that we heard about from our case study intermediaries that supported their funding journeys towards sustainable impact. And I did just want to highlight, our report was focused on the funding journeys of intermediaries. It didn't delve really deeply into some other very important questions about things like impact. And again, we'll talk about that as well. So the first thing I just wanted to mention, and there was more than this, obviously, but the first was intermediaries highlighted the value of securing long-term funding, which was appropriate to the stage the intermediary was at. So this importance of long-term funding was highlighted by a number of our case study intermediaries. And for a number of them, that looked like catalytic funding from philanthropy, and funding which was for a number of years, which really allowed them to do the exploratory and preparatory work that you need to do. And a couple who actually secured innovation grants from government to do a similar thing, which I think they noted was quite rare to have kind of multi-year, quite patient funding from government to do that. And the leaders of the organisations talked about how important it was that this funding was flexible. It allowed them to explore in that early stage. The second thing we learned about was, which was a bit of a success factor, was the importance of the alignment between the funder and the intermediary. And by alignment, I mean a shared passion for the cause or the problem that they're trying to solve, a shared belief in the work, shared aspirations for where it could go, and really importantly, a shared understanding of why intermediaries are important and what their work involves. So I guess that goes back to the earlier kind of commentary around the definition. So yeah, we highlight in the report a couple of examples. For example, Paul Ramsey Foundation, who also funded this research report, funding this type of work because they truly believe in the work that intermediaries does to tackle disadvantage in communities. And the third thing I'll mention, and then I'll pause for the end of this question, for some of our case study intermediaries, it was really important and valuable to them that they were able to leverage an auspicing arrangement. By auspicing, I mean being able to gain support from another organisation through a formal arrangement or otherwise. And I'll just give you some examples. For example, an intermediary may just be a standalone entity that doesn't require any support from another organisation to function. But you may be a research centre that sits within a university where you actually have an independent, a separate kind of advisory board or group, but you don't have independent governance or financial status. You really are part of the university. Or you may be an intermediary that's really a program that sits within a larger organisation. Or you may have an arrangement where you're essentially, borrowing or leveraging the relevant registrations and tax status of a larger organisation. And I think in some other jurisdictions, you might call that acting as a fiscal host. It might also be simply that you're sharing some back office functions, for example, with another organisation. So we've defined that quite broadly in the research, but we heard that can be hugely beneficial, especially in the early stages. You can access in-kind support. You can often have a funding contribution from that arrangement. You can leverage the reputation and standing of an existing organisation. And really importantly, it can be a bit of a safety net if intended funding doesn't come to fruition or there's a timing gap between funding streams. So I'll pause there. They were just a couple of the factors that we learned about that really supported the journeys of our case study organisations.
Thank you so much. I really actually value the fact that you had this funding and this mandate to dig a little bit deeper into the role, because as you say, it's not well known, but I think the other thing that's challenging is it often operates in the background, right? So it's not even seen. It's supporting the work of others, and that adds to the complexity, I suspect. So Tessa, I would like to shift maybe and ask you, because you were one of 8 case studies, right, that was part of SVA's research. Can you tell us a little bit more about Health Justice Australia and your work as a field-building intermediary?
Thanks, Sylvia. Hello, everyone. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining from the Gadigal Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. So the origin story for Health Justice Australia is a really nice example, I guess, of some of the concepts that I think we're grappling with in the space around intermediaries, because I am the founding CEO of an organisation, but the genesis of our work really lies in a movement. And that was a movement of health and legal assistance practitioners. So the language in Australia is publicly funded legal assistance. It might be equivalents to legal aid in other countries. And it was practitioners really sort of around almost 10 years ago now who started to respond to evidence about levels of unmet need in the communities that they were supposed to be supporting. So in the context of legal need in Australia, we know that many people experience legal problems as a regular part of their lives, but they don't necessarily identify as legal problems and they don't necessarily take to legal services. And we're not so much talking about interaction with the criminal justice system, we're talking about everyday problems that have legal solutions. So credit and debt, poor quality housing in rental and public housing particularly, navigating social security security systems, right through to, safety or vulnerability at home in a context of family violence or interaction with the child protection system. So these are, really difficult and often really complex situations in people's lives. And legal assistance services realised that there was this growing body of evidence about people who were never going to walk through their doors, but who were likely to bring these issues up in a setting of trust. And that setting of trust might be family or friends or colleagues. But in the service system, the evidence was really clear that health, and healthcare particularly, was a setting of trust. And so practitioners, borrowing very heavily on international evidence, including from North America and the UK, practitioners started to innovate in a new way of delivering their services by building partnerships well outside the justice system. And that's really what led to this idea about health justice partnership, was a partnership between existing services to collaborate around multiple intersecting health, legal and other problems in the lives of the people that those services were here to help. Services started piloting this, so they were able to secure research funding to investigate international models. They were able to pilot it in some of their local communities, and really critically, practitioners use their existing practitioner networks, professional networks, to share the lessons of what they do. And that's what really seeded the movement for Health Justice Partnership. And then, growing bodies of funding, but really small scale. 2 and 3 examples in the first instance, and then a bucket of funding that enabled 8 to be established in the state of Victoria, and a sense that they were onto something that was really responding to unmet need. And that was the genesis for recognising that what they wanted was a national centre of excellence. And I would say in those early days, really the driving purpose of the National Centre for Health Justice Partnership was a scaling agenda. It was about expanding the model. And that was really clear in the specs of the role that I applied for. But my background is, really social policy. I am a criminologist. I've worked in mental health. I've worked in forensic settings. I've worked in criminal justice and social policy. And what I love is the intersections. I love working across research, policy and practice. I love working at the intersections of, what in government we might think about as different portfolios, because what I often see is those intersections in people's lives. And so what really interested me about this work was the chance to shape service delivery and the environment in which those services are delivered around people's needs, really to help services respond to those intersections that are how people experience problems, which are often not how we've set up and designed our services. It's often really moving away from practitioner expertise or policy objectives. And that was really the opportunity that I saw in Health Justice Australia. So I think there's a lot in our work that aligns very closely with the language and the thinking around intermediaries. But it was actually a funder who introduced that language to us. And as we started to investigate the research and pick up on the Bridgespan work and on Tamaracks and on others, we just saw this beautiful alignment with what we were doing. And so I think there's something in what we've just been talking about in terms of recognising that if we're working at a space around innovation, if we're adapting, we are, as I say, we're working with existing services and helping them reshape what they do around unmet need. If that's the space we're working in, then we're not looking for fidelity to a model. We're not looking to codify and narrow and define really tightly what we're doing. We're, in that collective impact language, we're responding to what the field needs. And our role as Health Justice Australia is trying to help and push services to respond to the changing and complex needs of the communities that they're here to help. So that for me is really one of the clearest ways that we align with the international evidence about intermediaries. But I think that language is still really new. I think it's still really embryonic in the Australian context. And so we do see ourselves spanning a lot of that definition, a lot of that model that has been kind of put into the literature around intermediaries. And we work with peers, other intermediaries who would see themselves in some of that language, but not in others. And I think that for me is, we're talking about catalysing and we're talking about field building. I think that's what we're seeing in the space around intermediaries, as well as the function that intermediaries are performing in the work and in the communities that we're here to support.
That's lovely. Thank you. Because I think I loved, really articulating your genesis and how it really was. You didn't have a model you were necessarily setting out to replicate. It was more there was a need and you were responding to a gap that was preventing the impact that was being had in local communities, right? Which actually explains a lot of and validates a lot of what you were saying, Annabelle, about, you know what, there's such a breadth of functions here, and they are so essential. And conversely, you know, I would think that we set local place-based efforts up when we talk about that it's important that they focus on systems change, but then assume that they're going to be able to have significant impact in that realm operating in isolation. And that, I think, is one of those key areas where the intermediary plays a critical role. But I know, so I'm curious, because I know, Annabelle, you had the pleasure of a deep dive into 7 other case studies alongside Tessa's organization, as well as your own experience, as you said, as a field intermediary. What are some of those lessons, commonalities, differences that you saw across the different cases that you took a good look at?
Thanks, Sylvia. So we had eight case studies, as you mentioned, of Australian intermediaries, with Health Justice Australia being one of them. They were a real mix of those different types of categories that I mentioned before: field catalysts, evidence action labs, capability specialists, place-based backbones, or a combination of many of those. And they operate in a real mix of fields as well. So we've got justice reinvestment in Aboriginal communities. We have early childhood education and care, and employment for people experiencing disadvantage, just to name a couple. It was also really interesting that, and this was, I guess, part of the reason we were looking at this mix of intermediaries, but they're also at quite different stages of their journeys. So one, Indigenous eye health, is actually quite close to achieving its stated aspiration, and is at a really interesting time of thinking, well, what does that mean if we get there, and what's next? Some are quite mature organisations which have been operating for over 15 years or so. And really interestingly, one, Opportunity Child, is actually a case study of an intermediary that ceased operations after 6 years, primarily because it couldn't secure ongoing sustainable funding. So that's quite an interesting case study to read some of those lessons about, I guess, what unfolded there. So you can see just from that description, it's a real mix of kind of type, etc. We also learnt a bit about how they operate. And again, this has a focus on their funding journey rather than any other aspects of their journey. But there's a real mix of funding models amongst those case studies. There's one that is essentially a purely fee-for-service intermediary, COACT, but it's quite a unique intermediary in the sense that it reacted to a very particular change in the external environment around the outsourcing of government employment services. Many relying heavily on philanthropic funding and may well continue to do so, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Some which have secured government funding either to catalyse or some more ongoing. But most of them have a real mix. There was no really kind of one common funding model. I think the other interesting observation, and I started to talk a little bit about this before, was the real mix of structures in terms of how they operate. So not necessarily how they do their work as such, but how they're set up and how they operate. So one is a centre that's part of a university. A number are auspiced by larger organisations in lots of different forms, and a couple of standalone entities. So again, a real mix across those 8. I guess the really fascinating thing was what many of them share is what they need and some of those challenges they face, particularly around funding, despite all of those differences. So I'll just mention 2 of those. So one real commonality was around the need for untied funding to support indirect costs and capacity building. So many noted this challenge and highlighted that philanthropy and government funders can be much more focused on funding specific programs or initiatives rather than those core operations. SVA also experiences this, and our CEO talked recently about how precious that untied funding is for an intermediary. She talked about how it allows us to invest in research so that we understand the evidence, to build partnerships so that we can collaborate, to work on the end game and think about the options for scale, to do that policy and advocacy thinking before presenting it as something that can be funded, and really critically strengthening the organisation by investing in people and capability and leadership and technology and infrastructure. And of course, this question and issue about untied funding is part of a much broader challenge across the for-purpose sector, but I think it's felt very keenly by intermediaries. And if you're interested to read more about that, we published with the Centre for Social Impact some recent research on paying what it takes. And I know there's also in other jurisdictions, there's been quite a lot of thinking done around that as well. But the second thing I want to mention around the kind of shared challenge, and I think we might be building on this in another question, but many face challenges in demonstrating impact, or at least demonstrating it in a way that their funder expected them to. So we did observe that there's a real barrier to, and this is in Australia, to philanthropic support of field builders around those expectations of how impact needs to be evidenced, either before the funder will fund, or that there's a requirement that that impact is evidenced really early on in the funding period. And we think there's a perception, or there is a perception, that this is driven by that kind of lack of nuanced understanding about that invisible and an evolving role that field builders play. And we talked, I guess, a little bit before about definitions, and I talked about the bridge span definition, but actually our case study intermediaries use different language. You know, they talked about the glue that holds the field together, the explorers, the demonstrators, and I love that. To me, that spoke a lot more about what the role truly is. And for those case study intermediaries that were able to demonstrate impact or a contribution towards the outcomes they were trying to achieve, this was an enabler for securing additional or new funding from philanthropy and government. And for those who couldn't, it did represent a real barrier to securing funding. Our report didn't delve deeply into that question of impact, but Paul Ramsay Foundation, who funded this research, also funded a recent report by Mark Cabage, who I know is very well known to many of you, around evaluating the results of intermediary organisations. And it's a really fascinating read talks about this challenge and highlights some really important implications for funders about that question of impact. I'll pause there.
Beautiful. Thank you, Annabelle. I could have kept listening, but I think your comments have really captured its interest, both the huge variance, but also there's a coherence, right? There's some common elements. And I really resonated and connected dots between, Tessa, your comment about in many ways we're innovating, right? We're helping to innovate new approaches. And I then understood the tension around how that can make it difficult to demonstrate a specific impact, which is often what a funder is looking for. Because a lot of this you don't know. You can learn, you can share observations, you can advance thinking, but you can't, and you're also doing it in collaboration. So by nature, right? It's going to be you've contributed to, it's not yours to do. Really, really interesting. But so how did you wrestle with this question of impact, and how are you at Health Justice Australia, Tessa, starting to assess and articulate what impact looks like as you in your role as a field intermediary?
Yeah, this question about contribution, not attribution, is so important. And actually, that's a really good example of what it looks like when we are engaging in strategic advocacy. So we're both helping services understand that if they're working in collaboration, that's the kind of approach they need to bring to evaluation. And we're also trying to help funders and policymakers and the people who are commissioning services understand that at a sort of population or a program level. But let me go to how we think about our impact, because, you know, at its heart, our purpose is about improving health and justice in people's lives. I mean, that is our purpose statement. But we know that we're pursuing, I guess, what you might think of as a tertiary level strategy to achieve that. We don't deliver services, we don't fund services, we don't see clients or patients or community members directly. We support the practitioners, and we support practitioners who are collaborating to meet those needs. And for me, that thinking is really about recognising, you know, you can think about systems as these big, entrenched and amorphous kind of entities, but you can also think about systems in terms of the people within them. And that's how we define our impact, that we're working with practitioners in service systems to improve the outcomes they achieve in the lives of the people they support. So immediately you can see we've taken that step back from direct service delivery, and that's part of this space that we are in between as an intermediary. And so with that purpose in mind, we seek impact through three really clear areas. So the first is in building knowledge. And the generation of knowledge for us is both about research in the context of, you know, papers. Some of that is original research. Some of that is marshalling existing evidence to help us understand when collaboration might be useful, to help us understand what complexity looks like, both in people's lives and also in the service systems that we set up to respond to people's needs. So I guess what you might think of as a traditional approach to research. But part of the evolution of our work has recognised that we also need to be contributing practitioner-led evidence. And particularly if we're thinking about practitioners and services who are innovating, they're out there doing it. They don't have time to be collecting and capturing the insights of what's working and, crucially, what's not. So we've really, you know, our very first formation of strategy was about research, policy and practice. And we've evolved that to recognise knowledge building and the different kinds of knowledge that we need to be capturing to drive a learning system. So knowledge is really clear articulation of the first area of impact for us. The second is absolutely this work to support practitioners. So that practice area is really recognising that capability requires its own sorts of skills. That collaboration requires its own kind of capability and skill sets. You know, we don't need to tell a legal assistance practitioner, we don't need to tell a legal aid lawyer that the experience of family violence in their client's life might be affecting that person's physical or mental health, and the mental health and the physical health of their children. But we do need to help a legal practitioner work in a health environment that is often multidisciplinary, team-based, not about privacy, about, you know, shared care, might be taking instructions on a ward, might be working with patients who are facing really serious or chronic health issues. These are not things that legal practitioners are necessarily skilled and accustomed to working with. And so when we talk about the capability to collaborate, it's the ability to understand a very different operating environment, often a very different language, and to be able to connect with that in a way that is adding value, that is productive more than, you know, in the context of legal practice, more than you might do in your shopfront legal service. And vice versa. We need to help health practitioners understand that the role of a lawyer in their team is not ambulance chasing. This is not about medical negligence. This is about adding an extra set of tools, an extra set of capability to what is often already a multidisciplinary environment, but still within a very strict kind of understanding of healthcare. So those are examples of what we mean when we're talking about the capability to partner among practitioners. And then, of course, we can have the most embedded partnerships in a local context, but if the policy design, the funding, the authorising environment in which those services are being delivered, if that capability to collaborate isn't understood at that level, then we can't make any gain on the collaboration at a local level. And that's what connects us with our third purpose, or our third area of impact really, which is strategic advocacy. And here we're translating the lessons from Health Justice Partnership in place to the decisions about policy, about service design, about funding and delivery, and to the research environment that is shaping the articulation of outcomes. And so it's through the building of knowledge, the supporting of capability and practice, and the strategic advocacy that we see our role as an intermediary and our opportunity for impact. And so, Sylvia, if I may, I just want to spend a minute on this slide because, I can tell a really clear story about that here in this webinar, but exactly as Annabelle says, translating that to numbers and measurable outcomes, particularly for funders and other decision makers, is really hard. And so, if you look at this slide that we've got up now, this is a graph that shows the growth of Health Justice Partnership, particularly since Health Justice Australia was established in 2016. So you remember I said really the core thinking for the practitioners who wanted a national centre of excellence was to expand the model. I realised, when I was going for this role, I realised we needed to know what difference this model made. I wasn't interested in just expanding a model if we didn't understand its impact. And so we really shaped our core strategy around expansion and effectiveness. But this graph shows really phenomenal growth in the Australian Health Justice Partnership landscape, which we've shown growth from around 20 or 40 when we were first being established to now 110 examples of collaboration around the country. So I could just shop that graph around to every funder and every policymaker that I speak to show Health Justice Australia's impact. But we know from our monitoring work, and that's both sort of data collection and working directly with services, that underneath that top line, there are real questions about sustainability and real questions about impact of collaboration and ability to really work differently through partnership. So many of these services are still funded as though they're pilots. They're still relying on year funding, even though the work to establish and maintain trust in partnerships has to be sustained. It's absolutely core foundations to working collaboratively. We know that many of the evaluations of these services are done from a single perspective, basically the perspective of the funder. So if you're working in a health justice partnership and you've got health funding, the outcomes you're measuring are likely to be health. And we're not necessarily looking at what difference did legal assistance make to those health outcomes and vice versa. So we're really careful about the story that we tell and the role that we play, not just in collecting and curating evidence, but in using that to understand innovation in this context. And that's what makes the outcomes piece really difficult, actually, really a kind of constant challenge. On the flip side, we think about health justice partnership in our own work as a systems change agenda, but we also see that these collaborations are themselves driving systemic change. So we see that in the mindset of the practitioners who are now able to probe more widely about the problems in the lives of the people that they're helping because they have a greater range of tools and they've got access to a broader set of capabilities in responding to those needs. We're seeing services start to collaborate on the funding, research and policy advocacy as well as the service delivery. But that's taken years to achieve, and building the kind of body of metrics that reflects that is part of our work. I think the really critical next question in our work is what is the role of communities and of lived experience specifically in health justice partnership? So, at their best, health justice partnerships are collaborations between services and in the service system. So these are formal, often professional-based funded service environments. But we know that systems change doesn't happen without centering community. And we do see that centering of community in some of our work. So there's a really important part of our work that is led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community controlled organisations who have really been at the forefront of this kind of recognising multiple intersecting problems in communities' lives and shaping services in response to those communities. So that's a really good example of where community need is centred. We do work with organisations where peer workforce strategies are really core. So peer workforce in the context, for instance, of mental health, where your practitioners are people with their own lived experience of mental ill health or the mental health system and are bringing that expertise into the service environment. I think those are really clear examples of centering community and lived experience. But on the whole, our service systems have a long way to go to be really centering communities in the power that services hold, in the decision-making, in the allocation of resources. And so that, for me, is the really critical question for us in the future. What is our role in supporting that centering of community in the partnerships that we see as really responsive to community need?
I think one of the things that I really appreciated about you talking about impact and your own role in evolution is the clarity with which you could state what we are and what we aren't. And I think that was probably really instrumental in then you being very clear about what our contribution is and therefore what to track. So there's something there for me that really resonated. And I love that you're evolving next to really being much more intentional in a focused way about the role of who we would call context experts and their insights and how critical they are to system innovation overall. Just think it's great.
Can I do a very quick shout out just prompted by that? I mean, one of the things that we've really benefited from is a sister organisation in the United States. So the National Centre for Medical Legal Partnership is 10 years older than us, and we have absolutely benefited from the learning and the sharing of that learning that they did. And they were really instrumental in the recommendation for there to be an equivalent in the Australian context. So again, when we think about that capability, I haven't seen them use this language of intermediary, but there's no question they played a really key role in us being able to set up very quickly with such a clear sense of what difference we could make.
Wow. And it does actually speak to the power and the need for relationships and camaraderie, especially when you're innovating something new, which kind of leads beautifully, I think, into our last formal question. So before we go there, I'm just going to do a shout out for those of you who registered for our webinar. We want to open up the line after this to you and to hearing from you. So if you haven't had an insight to share yet that you posted, or if you don't have a question or you have a question kind of bubbling, we'd urge you to plop it in to the chat so we can go to what you're thinking about next. But Annabelle, my last question, formal question, was about the how-to guide. So sustainability and evolution of these intermediaries and the rich knowledge that they've kind of amassed through their role. How does that get sustained? What advice did you or insights did you share with funders, and or what challenges did you get about this intermediary role through the research you did?
Thanks, Sylvia. We learned a lot about the challenges, what intermediaries need, and I guess some of the things we're urging funders to think about. I'll mention, I guess, three things we learned, and then I'll just touch on the funder piece. But one of the key things, and I mentioned this before, is it is quite difficult for intermediaries to be sustainable without some form of philanthropic support at some time. And some of our case studies, as I mentioned, expect that philanthropy is always going to be a part of their funding model. And when we've just talked about the complexity of the work and the time it takes and the type of activities, that does make some sense to me. The second thing is just that really key learning about intermediaries needing time to explore and to pivot and to change. They can't really be tied to planning an end state funding model from year one of operations, which is occasionally what we kind of hear funders asking for. Intermediaries have to remain agile so that they can respond to what's happening in the field and to external factors and to capture new opportunities. And that means the funding also needs to be flexible. And the last thing was just around, not all income sources are going to work for every intermediary. So a really key example of this is fee for service or earned income. It can be really challenging for intermediaries to make that work. Many of our case studies have a portion of their revenue model includes fee for service in some way or another, or they've tried it at some time. But it can really only be successful when you have a product or a service to sell in a market that is willing to pay for it. And so not all intermediaries have that, but even if you do, it can be really challenging to make that work and for that to be profitable. It requires specific skills, capabilities, and even if it's working well, it might only just cover its operating costs. And a really key risk is around fee for service distracting an intermediary from its core activities or its mission just because somebody, I guess, has urged them that this is a way to really, support your funding model. But the final observation I'd just like to make is around the role philanthropy can play in addition to funding, because this was really interesting from the report. So obviously the provision of funding is super important, but funders can also do other things which our case study intermediaries found very valuable. They can provide in-kind support, whether that's access to specific skills or capabilities or people within their organisation. They can actually help build the broader ecosystem. Really importantly, they can attract other funders to support the work. And we had a few examples of this in the case studies. And this can lead to having a diversity of funders, which can be really valuable to intermediaries. Obviously, it can be a bit of a safety net if one funder ceases to support, or it could also mean overall, maybe there's a bigger pool of funding. But our CEO, Susie Riddell, talked about it being more than this. She talked about how we can learn different things from different funders. There's different funding cycles, there's different networks, there's different expertise that we can access. So we have our research report, we have our accompanying case studies, quite detailed report, but Paul Ramsay Foundation also developed a kind of how-to guide for funders, and it's that one there you can see on the screen, Growing Fields, Shifting Systems, and it's based heavily on insights from our research. And it's a bit of intended to be a bit more of a practical guide for funders. You know, as a funder, what should you think about? What are the key considerations if you're funding an intermediary or you're thinking about funding an intermediary? And that document has kind of 8 key considerations for funders. I'm just wondering, Sylvia, I'm conscious of the time. Do you want me to just spend 2 minutes whizzing through what those are, or would you prefer just for, yeah, okay, I'll just quickly do that and then I'll
go quick through, but we've got some nice juicy questions starting to pop into the box. So I want to protect time for that as well.
Fantastic. I'll just whiz through them really quickly so you get a sense of it. But the guide, Growing Field, Shifting Systems, talks about 8 key considerations. 1, invest in your own understanding of field building intermediaries, the influence and impact they have and what makes them work. 2, be purposeful about your funding in the field. 3, identify the roles you can play in catalysing, growing or sustaining. 4, fund in ways that enable the intermediaries to have influence and impact through long-term, patient, multi-year core funding. A lot of things tied up in that one consideration. 5, be curious and invest in learning and evaluation. 6, be reflexive and conscious of your own biases so your funding doesn't reinforce existing inequities and damaging power dynamics. 7, coordinate and collaborate with other funders. And 8, support that broader field and build the funding field for the work, enabling collaboration and impact over time. So that's a super quick whiz through those, but if you have a look at the guide, you can read more about it.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you. So I'm going to turn it over, Jaime, if you wouldn't mind being our quarterback for questions. I saw some good ones in the Q&A box.
Absolutely. So the first one I'm seeing is from Amanda Wilson, who asks, would really like to know what are the key metrics that intermediaries commonly measure their impact or report to funders and partners? It's a good one. Any thoughts?
Do you want me to go? Shall I go first?
Yeah, go.
I mean, there's so much to that question, including what are the common measures? And I would say we're not yet at a point where there are common measures, in my experience in the Australian context, but there's certainly a conversation across intermediaries about the kinds of ways we work and a real interest in sort of aligning some of that. So, for example, strategic advocacy, you might call that policy advocacy, you might call that systems change more broadly. There's a really keen interest from us as organisations and from the funders, particularly that we're working with, to measure that. And then there are really blunt tools that people assume are going to be the ways to measure that. So, you know, I know colleagues of mine working in intermediaries have been asked to report on the numbers of meetings that they've had with political or policy actors when those organisations don't feel like the number of interactions is a useful measure of impact or outcomes. So we are measuring strategic advocacy in terms of where we're seeing the conversation change. We can do that really clearly in terms of mentions of health justice partnership in policy documents. But we also use health justice partnership as a demonstration of collaboration. So we also want to see policy change where collaboration is not just a word, it's actually a different way of working, and that's understood in terms of investment. So that's just one example. I think the other one to really think about is the learning agenda. So, you know, I sometimes think if we were able to demonstrate a learning system in the systems work that we do, we might say job done. So that requires us to be learning. It requires us to be influencing learning in the system. And there are all sorts of ways that we can measure that learning. And the other one, obviously, is the capability piece. What does it look like to change capability, and how do we measure that? And so we talk about practitioners' sense of confidence that they are able to respond to a broader range of factors in people's lives. And that can have really direct impacts in terms of practitioner wellbeing. And at this stage in a pandemic, practitioner wellbeing in the health and justice systems is really significant. It's a really significant outcome. So there's quite different ways to measure that, but those, I think, all align very much to this kind of broad conversation we've had around intermediaries.
Beautiful. Anything you would add, Annabelle?
Only to say is I certainly don't have the answers to that question, but just to also refer you back to that report I mentioned by Mark Cabage, because he's really delving into this quite deeply. Again, I guess it doesn't contain all of the answers, but it really articulates some of the challenges and some of the key things for funders, or implications for funders to be really aware of. And that includes, avoiding holding intermediaries strictly accountable for specific changes in systems, because their contribution has already been influenced, if they're acting as an intermediary, by multiple actors and interventions and factors. So again, it doesn't provide all the answers, but it does delve a bit more deeply into this question. So you might find that helpful.
It's interesting because I know for us as intermediaries, one of the other things we look at is, to what extent have we collectively across these localized efforts grown the network, for one thing, into more places. But secondly, we look at how have we made lives better for people, for the people whose issue, by aggregating up to some degree some of the work of the partners, and also looking at to what degree have we seen capacity shift or changes in policy, practice, behavior as a result of these connections. Those are just some key metrics that we kind of look at a broad level. Next, great question. I'm mindful of time, but go right ahead and jump in if you don't mind, around the second question. Yeah.
I'm seeing Kim Ghostkeeper is asking, how do you capture and share the relationship learnings that will be helpful to others?
I've thrown a bit of a response in the chat, and I'll just pick up on that. And I think we see that as a really core function of us as an intermediary, and actually what was really missing in the space. So, I mentioned there was a movement, there was kind of informal practitioner networks, but the collection of that learning, the facilitation of it has been a really key part of the way we work. And first and foremost, we convene networks to enable that, but we also curate those. So an example through the pandemic has been, as I mentioned before, the really serious impacts on the practitioners' well-being of working through a pandemic, heightened need in the communities they were serving, heightened need in their own lives, in many contexts in Australia, lockdowns. So practitioners suddenly outside of the formal and informal supervisionary opportunities in a workplace, having to keep files about family violence separate from their children, like really heightened stress environment, and still an expectation of delivering service. So the ability for us to convene networks that allowed practitioners to learn from their peers, to support each other, and then our collation of that evidence and putting that into the space through reports like our Collaborating Through COVID report, that's a really core function of what we do. Yeah.
Anything that you saw in addition?
Yeah, just one small thing I'll mention that we referenced in the report was where we were talking about the other roles that funders can have other than just funding. So there was an example of Paul Ramsay Foundation, so a funder convening learning events. So I think primarily with the organisations that they were funding, could be wrong about that, but learning events which brings together its funded partners who are intermediaries and kind of facilitated conversations. So that was one way in which kind of learnings could be shared amongst organisations, but it was led by the funder.
Beautiful. The other one that comes to mind for me is also what assumptions are being challenged for us as we've been doing this work, because I think then that helps to drive that shift in thinking as well. Before we leap to the last little bit that we were looking forward to feedback and comments on, I just want to shine a light on a comment posted by Liz Forsberg. Thank you, Liz. She said that she is in her own role working with a funder who's interested in funding some field building. And much of their contribution is in kind, but the challenge for them is finding other funders to co-invest. And there are still very few funders in Canada focused on infrastructure intermediaries and nonprofits. And so there's another shout out, I think, to Paul Ramsey Foundation in Australia and others. I think in Tamarack's history, the McConnell Family Foundation here in Canada has also been an instrumental investor in this kind of invisible intermediary work. But I hear you, Liz, and I don't know that you're alone. So before we wrap things up, I know maybe we only have a couple minutes. So we were going to ask you all a question, but I think maybe what we can do is send it out, possibly with the materials, because we're running quickly out of time. But I do want to not wrap up without a great big thank you, Tessa and Annabelle, for your generosity, for getting up so early in the morning, and to all of the folks who've been able to join us today. I have a sense this is the beginning of a much longer conversation, or a conversation part 2, which I would love to have with you both. So thank you. Thank you to everybody. And in particular, Annabelle, Tessa, so appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Any last words that we need to handle before we sign off, Jaime?
I think we're great. Thanks so much.
Okay. Have a great afternoon or morning, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.